Rebecca had been living on her little piece of heaven for 8 years before everything changed. Her property wasn't huge, just 5 acres of land with a modest house, a vegetable garden, and an old oak tree that had probably been standing there longer than she'd been alive. The best part about her place was the well. It had been dug decades ago, long before she bought the property, and it gave her the cleanest, coldest water she'd ever tasted. No monthly bills, no chlorine taste, just pure water straight from the earth. Life was simple and quiet, exactly how she liked it. She'd wake up to birds chirping, tend to her garden, and watch the sunset from her porch without a single neighbor in sight. That all changed when the construction crews showed up on the empty land next to her property. At first, she didn't think much of it. Development was happening everywhere, and she figured maybe they'd build a few houses. She was wrong. Within 6 months, they'd cleared almost 100 acres and started building what they called Meadowbrook Estates. It was one of those planned communities with identical houses, perfect lawns, and a fancy entrance gate that seemed completely unnecessary. Rebecca watched as house after house went up. They all looked the same, like someone had copied and pasted the same building plan 200 times. Each one had the exact same beige siding, the exact same black shutters, and the exact same tiny yard. It wasn't her style, but she didn't judge. People wanted what they wanted. The first time someone from the HOA knocked on her door, she thought they were lost. It was a Saturday morning, and she'd been replanting some tomatoes when a man in pressed khakis and a polo shirt walked up her driveway. He introduced himself as Brian Hutchins, the president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. "We're so excited to have you as our neighbor," he said with a smile that showed way too many teeth. "I wanted to personally invite you to join our community." Rebecca wiped the dirt from her hands and tried to be polite. "I appreciate that, but I'm not part of the development. My property's been here long before your community was built." Brian's smile didn't fade. "Oh, I understand that. But we're offering legacy memberships to adjacent properties. Think of all the benefits. You'd have access to our community pool, our clubhouse, our events." "I've got my own pond for swimming," Rebecca said, "and I'm pretty happy with my quiet evenings at home." He pulled out a folder with papers. "The monthly fees are very reasonable, just $250, and you'd be part of a wonderful community." $250 a month to be part of something she never asked to join? Rebecca politely declined. Brian kept smiling, but she noticed his eye twitch just a little. He handed her his card anyway and told her to call if she changed her mind. She didn't change her mind. But Brian came back 2 weeks later. Then again a month after that. Each time his smile got a little tighter, and his tone got a little less friendly. The 4th time he showed up, he brought another board member. With him, a woman named Patricia who wore pearls and looked at Rebecca's property like it was a junkyard. "You really should reconsider," Patricia said, looking at Rebecca's garden. "Your property affects all of our property values." Rebecca felt her jaw tighten. "My property was here first. I keep it clean and maintained. What I do with my land is my business. But we have standards," Brian added. "Covenant codes. Things that keep the neighborhood looking uniform and beautiful." "Then it's a good thing I'm not in your neighborhood," Rebecca replied, and shut the door. After that, Brian stopped being friendly. When she'd wave at him driving past, he'd stare straight ahead. She heard through the grapevine that he'd been complaining about her at HOA meetings, calling her property an eyesore, even though her place looked perfectly fine. Then about 3 months after their last conversation, Rebecca noticed something wrong with her water. It started small. The pressure from her kitchen faucet seemed weaker than usual. She figured maybe there was sediment in the line and didn't worry too much about it. But over the next few days, it got worse. The shower went from a strong spray to a sad dribble. The washing machine took forever to fill. Within 2 weeks, she could barely get enough water pressure to wash her dishes. Her once reliable well was failing, and she had no idea why. Rebecca wasn't the type to panic, but she also wasn't the type to ignore a problem. She called a well service company and scheduled an inspection. The technician who showed up was an older guy named Frank, who'd been working with wells for 30 years. He pulled up in a truck that had seen better days and got to work checking her pump, her pressure tank, and finally the well itself. Frank worked quietly for about an hour, running tests and lowering equipment down into the well. Rebecca made him some iced tea and waited on the porch, trying not to worry about how much this was going to cost. When Frank finally walked over, the look on his face told her it was bad. "Ma'am, I've got some news and you're not going to like it," he said, setting down his equipment. "How bad is it?" Frank pulled off his cap and scratched his head. "Your well's been sabotaged. Someone poured concrete mix down your well casing." Rebecca felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. "What, are you sure?" "Positive. I pulled up samples. There's hardened concrete in there, blocking your water flow. This wasn't an accident. Someone did this deliberately. Can you fix it?" Frank shook his head. "Not without drilling a whole new well. The concrete's set too deep. You're looking at $15,000 minimum." $15,000. Rebecca's savings account flashed through her mind. She could cover it, but barely. And the thought that someone had done this on purpose made her blood boil. Who would do something like this, she asked, though deep down she was already starting to suspect. "Can't say for sure," Frank replied. "But in my experience, this kind of thing doesn't happen randomly. You had any disputes with neighbors?" "Anyone angry at you?" Rebecca thought about Brian and his increasingly hostile visits. She thought about Patricia and her comments about property values. She thought about how the HOA had been pressuring her to join their community, and how she'd kept refusing. "I might have an idea," she said quietly. That night, Rebecca went through her security camera footage. She'd installed cameras a year ago after some kids had been joyriding through the area. She had one pointed at her driveway, and another that covered the side of her house where the well was located. She scrolled back 3 days, then 4, then 5, and there it was. 3 nights before her water problem started, at 2 in the morning, her camera caught 2 figures walking onto her property. The footage was grainy because of the darkness, but she could make out enough. One person was tall and wearing khakis. The other was shorter, stockier. They walked right past the camera toward the side of her house where the well was located. They stayed for about 20 minutes, then left. Rebecca's hands shook as she paused the video. The tall figure looked exactly like Brian. She couldn't be 100% certain from the footage alone, but every instinct she had told her it was him. She sat back in her chair, staring at the frozen image on her screen. They'd actually done it. The HOA had sabotaged her well, probably hoping she'd give up, sell her property, or finally cave and join their community. Rebecca had always been the type to avoid conflict. She liked her quiet life and didn't enjoy drama. But as she sat there in the glow of her computer screen, hauling water jugs in from town just to make coffee the next morning, something hardened inside her. If they wanted to play dirty, she could play too. And she had a feeling they had no idea what they'd just started. The next morning, Rebecca called the police. She'd spent half the night thinking about what to do, and reporting the crime seemed like the obvious first step. Officer Martinez showed up around noon, a young guy who looked fresh out of the academy. Rebecca showed him the security footage and explained about the well. He watched the video 3 times, squinting at the grainy figures. "Can you identify who these people are?" "I'm pretty sure the tall one is Brian Hutchins. He's the HOA president from next door. He's been pressuring me to join their association for months." Officer Martinez took notes. "Pretty sure isn't the same as certain, ma'am. The video's too dark to make a positive identification. But it's him. I know it is. The problem is the footage shows people on your property, but it doesn't show them actually doing anything to your well. They could claim they were checking on something or they got lost." Rebecca felt her frustration rising. "Someone poured concrete down my well. It's going to cost me $15,000 to fix. That's not nothing. I understand, and I'm filing a report. But realistically, this is going to be hard to prosecute without clearer evidence or a confession. Have you considered pursuing this as a civil matter?" A civil matter. That meant lawyers, court costs, and months of legal battles. Rebecca thanked the officer and showed him out, feeling defeated before she'd even started. Over the next few days, life became a nightmare. Rebecca had to drive to town every morning to fill up 5-gallon water jugs from her friend Katie's house. She'd haul them back, ration the water throughout the day, and repeat the process. Showers became a luxury. She couldn't do laundry at home. Her garden started wilting because she couldn't spare enough water to keep it irrigated properly. Meanwhile, she could look out her window and see the sprinklers running in Meadowbrook Estates, their perfect lawns getting soaked every evening like clockwork. The irony wasn't lost on her. A week after the well inspection, Rebecca decided to confront Brian directly. She drove into the development, past the fancy entrance gate that was always open anyway, and pulled up to the clubhouse where the HOA held their meetings. Brian's car was parked outside. She found him in his office, a small room decorated with photos of the community and various awards the HOA had won for excellence in community management. He looked up when she walked in, and his expression shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like amusement. "Rebecca, what can I do for you? You can tell me why you sabotaged my well." Brian leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "That's a serious accusation. I hope you have proof." "I have security footage of you on my property 3 nights before my well stopped working." "Do you?" "'Cause I walk my dog every evening. Sometimes he wanders. I might have stepped onto your property by accident while looking for him." His smile was cold. "That's not a crime. My well inspector found concrete poured down my well casing." "That doesn't happen by accident," Brian shrugged. "That's terrible, and I'm sorry you're dealing with that. But I don't know anything about it. Have you considered that maybe your well is just old? Things break down. Maybe you should have joined the community when you had the chance. We have city water. Very reliable." Rebecca felt her hands balling into fists. "You did this to force me to sell or join your HOA. That's quite a conspiracy theory." Brian stood up, moving toward the door like he was done with the conversation. "If you want to make wild accusations, I suggest you get a lawyer. Otherwise, I have work to do." Rebecca left the clubhouse shaking with anger. Brian's smug expression was burned into her mind. He knew exactly what he'd done, and he knew she couldn't prove it. At least that's what he thought. That evening, Rebecca sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and started researching. She'd never been the litigious type, but desperate times called for desperate measures. She needed to understand her legal options. As she searched through property law websites and forums, something caught her eye. It was a discussion thread about easements. Someone was asking about old easement agreements and whether they could be revoked. Rebecca's brain started clicking. Easements. Her property had an easement. She remembered seeing something about it in her property records when she bought the place 8 years ago. But she'd never paid much attention to it. She dug through her filing cabinet until she found her property deed and the associated documents. There it was, buried in the paperwork, an easement agreement from 40 years ago, when her land had been part of a larger farm. The agreement granted an easement for a water line to pass through the southern edge of her property. At the time, it had probably seemed insignificant. The original landowner had agreed to let the county run a water line across a small corner of the property for a payment of $100 and the promise that the property owner would maintain access to equivalent water service. Rebecca's heart started beating faster. She pulled up a map of the water lines in the area. It took some digging through county records, but she found what she was looking for. The municipal water line that served Meadowbrook Estates ran right through her easement. Every drop of water that went to those 200 cookie-cutter houses flowed through a pipe on her land. She read the easement agreement again, focusing on the specific language. "So long as the grantor has access to equivalent water service." The grantor. That meant the property owner. That meant her. Rebecca grabbed her phone and called Katie. "Do you know any real estate lawyers?" Katie's cousin's husband practiced real estate law in the city. His name was Thomas Chen, and he agreed to meet with Rebecca the next day. She drove an hour to his office, bringing all her property documents, the well inspector's report, the police report, and the security footage. Thomas listened to her story without interrupting, occasionally jotting down notes. When she finished, he sat back and studied the easement agreement. "This is interesting," he said finally. "Very interesting. Can I revoke it?" Thomas tapped his pen against the desk. "The language here is pretty clear. The easement is conditional upon you having equivalent water service. Since your well has been destroyed, you no longer have water service. The condition has been violated. So I can shut off their water? Legally, you can notify all relevant parties that you intend to revoke the easement. However, we need to be strategic about this." Thomas looked at her seriously. "This is going to create a massive problem for 200 families. The water company will fight you. The HOA will definitely fight you. You need to be prepared for that. They destroyed my well. They cost me $15,000. They've made my life miserable. I understand. And I think you have a strong case. But we need to do this by the book. First, we'll send a formal notice to the HOA, the water company, and the county. We'll give them 30 days to respond. In that notice, we'll state that unless the HOA pays for your new well and compensates you for damages, you'll exercise your right to revoke the easement. Rebecca felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. Will that work? Thomas smiled. Put it this way. Without that easement, the water company would have to reroute their entire line. That would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and take months. In the meantime, 200 families would have no water. The HOA board would face lawsuits from every single homeowner. They'd be ruined. Good. The question is whether they'll call your bluff or take you seriously. Rebecca thought about Brian's smug face in his office. They think I'm just some woman who'll give up and go away. They have no idea who they're dealing with. Thomas started drafting the letter that afternoon. It was 3 pages of legal language, but the core message was simple. Pay up or lose your water. They sent it certified mail to Brian, to the entire HOA board, to the water company, and to the county water department. Rebecca went home that night and filled up her water jugs again. The same routine she'd been doing for weeks. But this time she smiled while she did it. Let them see how they liked living without water. She had a feeling things were about to get very interesting in Meadowbrook Estates. The certified letters went out on a Tuesday. By Thursday morning, Rebecca's phone wouldn't stop ringing. She let most of the calls go to voicemail, listening to them later with a cup of coffee. The first few were from the water company's legal department, asking her to call them back immediately to discuss a matter of urgent importance. Then came Brian's call. His voice on the voicemail was tight and controlled, but she could hear the anger underneath. Rebecca, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you need to call me back right away. This is serious. She deleted it without a second thought. The best call came from someone named Gerald Wright, who identified himself as an attorney representing the HOA. His message was all business, threatening legal action if she proceeded with her baseless attempt to interfere with essential utilities serving a residential community. Rebecca saved that one. She played it for Thomas when she met with him on Friday. Thomas laughed. Baseless. That's rich. Did you tell him about your well? I haven't called anyone back. You said to let you handle the communication. Good. Let them sweat for a few days. The 30-day clock is ticking, and right now they're scrambling trying to figure out if you're serious. Over the weekend, Rebecca noticed increased activity in Meadowbrook Estates. Cars she didn't recognize were coming and going from the clubhouse. She figured the HOA had called an emergency meeting. Part of her wished she could be a fly on the wall for that conversation. She didn't have to wonder long. On Monday morning, Katie called her, barely able to contain her excitement. Girl, you're the talk of the town. My hairdresser lives in Meadowbrook and she says the whole community is in chaos. What are they saying? Brian called an emergency meeting Saturday night. He told everyone you're trying to extort the HOA, that you're threatening to cut off their water unless they pay you a ridiculous amount of money. He's trying to rally everyone against you. Rebecca felt a flash of anger. I'm not extorting anyone. They destroyed my well. I know. But here's the good part. Some of the residents started asking questions. Like, why would you suddenly threaten them unless something happened? And when Brian got defensive and wouldn't give straight answers, people got suspicious. Apparently, it turned into a huge argument. Really? Yeah. My hairdresser said about half the room was ready to grab pitchforks and come after you. But the other half was saying that if the HOA did something to provoke you, then it's the HOA's fault. The meeting ended with nothing resolved and everyone angry. Rebecca smiled. Division in the ranks. That was exactly what she'd hoped for. The next day, she got a surprise visit. A woman in her 40s knocked on her door looking nervous. She introduced herself as Linda Torres, a resident of Meadowbrook Estates. I hope you don't mind me coming by, Linda said. I know things are tense right now. Rebecca crossed her arms but didn't shut the door. What do you want? The truth. Brian's been feeding us his version of events, but something doesn't add up. He says you're trying to shake down the HOA for money, but I've driven past your property before. You seem like a reasonable person, so I'm asking you directly. What happened? Rebecca studied the woman's face. She seemed genuine. After a moment, she invited Linda inside and told her everything. The pressure to join the HOA, Brian's increasingly hostile visits, the sabotaged well, the security footage, the $15,000 it would cost to fix. Linda listened quietly, her expression growing more troubled as the story went on. When Rebecca finished, Linda shook her head in disgust. I knew something was off. Brian's been acting weird for months, paranoid about property values and appearances. But I never thought he'd do something like this. Do you believe me? I do. And I think other people will too if they hear your side. The problem is Brian controls the information flow in the community. He's the one who sends out all the emails and runs the meetings. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable, Rebecca said. I just want my well fixed and compensation for what I've been through. They're the ones who chose to make this into a war. Linda stood up to leave. For what it's worth, I'm on your side, and I'm going to make sure other people know the real story. True to her word, Linda started talking. Within a few days, the narrative in Meadowbrook Estates began to shift. Rebecca heard through Katie's hairdresser network that residents were starting to demand answers from the HOA board. Some people were asking to see proof that Rebecca was lying. Others were questioning why Brian had been so secretive about the details. The water company, meanwhile, took a different approach. Their regional manager, a no-nonsense woman named Carol Peters, called Rebecca directly. Ms. Rebecca, I'm hoping we can resolve this situation amicably, Carol said. I've reviewed the easement agreement and I understand your position. But you have to understand ours. We have 200 families depending on that water line. Those families should be angry at the HOA, not at me. Perhaps. But right now we need to find a solution. What would it take for you to maintain the easement? I already stated my terms in the letter. The HOA pays for my new well and compensates me for damages. Carol sighed. The problem is we can't force the HOA to do anything. We're just the utility company. But I can tell you that rerouting our line would cost approximately $800,000 and take at least 8 months. During that time, we'd have to truck water in for temporary service. It would be a nightmare. That sounds like a problem for the HOA to solve. You're right. But I wanted you to hear it from me. The clock is ticking, and if we don't have a resolution soon, we'll have no choice but to start planning the reroute. That means going to the county commissioners, getting permits, and notifying all the residents. This is going to become very public very quickly. After Carol hung up, Rebecca sat quietly for a moment. Part of her felt guilty about the innocent families who'd be caught in the crossfire. But another part of her, the part that had been hauling water jugs and taking cold showers for weeks, reminded her that she wasn't the villain here. Brian was. The following week brought the development she'd been waiting for. Thomas called her with news that made her grin. Gerald Wright, the HOA's attorney, wants to negotiate. What changed? My guess? Someone did the math. Between the cost of the water reroute, the potential lawsuits from angry homeowners, and the criminal investigation we mentioned in our letter, they're looking at financial ruin. Plus, I did some digging. The HOA's insurance won't cover intentional acts of sabotage. If this goes to court and we prove Brian destroyed your well, the HOA is personally liable. So they're scared. They're terrified. Gerald wants to meet next week to discuss settlement terms. He mentioned something about Brian being willing to take responsibility. Rebecca felt a surge of satisfaction. Brian's going to confess? Not directly to you, but apparently, some of the HOA board members have been doing their own investigation. Someone found receipts for concrete mix purchased on Brian's credit card 2 days before your well failed. The date matches the timeline perfectly. Rebecca couldn't believe it. He was dumb enough to leave a paper trail? Arrogance makes people sloppy. He probably never thought anyone would investigate. Now the board's in damage control mode. They're trying to figure out how to fix this without bankrupting the entire community. I want them to know I'm serious. I'm not backing down, they know. The question now is whether they'll meet your terms or try to lowball you. My advice, stand firm. We have all the leverage. That night, Rebecca drove into town to fill up her water jugs again. As she was loading them into her truck, she ran into Brian's wife, Michelle, at the grocery store. Michelle had always been friendly in a distant way, giving little waves when they'd pass each other before the development went up. Michelle looked exhausted. When she saw Rebecca, she stopped, seeming uncertain about whether to speak. Finally, she approached. I'm sorry, Michelle said quietly. I didn't know what Brian had done. I found out from the other board members. He told me he was just trying to convince you to join the HOA. Rebecca didn't know what to say. Michelle looked genuinely distraught. He's been obsessed with this community, Michelle continued. It's all he talks about. Property values, standards, reputation. I think it made him crazy, but that doesn't excuse what he did to you. No, it doesn't. The board is voting tomorrow night on whether to accept your settlement terms. I just wanted you to know that not everyone in Meadowbrook is like Brian. Some of us think you deserve justice. Michelle walked away before Rebecca could respond. As Rebecca drove home with her water jugs rattling in the truck bed, she thought about what Michelle had said. Not everyone in Meadowbrook was the enemy. Most of them were just regular people who'd bought homes and had no idea their HOA president was a vindictive jerk. But that didn't change what needed to happen. Brian had to be held accountable, and the HOA had to pay for what they'd done. Rebecca pulled into her driveway and looked over at the perfect lawns of Meadowbrook Estates, their sprinklers still running like nothing was wrong. Soon, she thought. Soon they'd understand that actions have consequences. The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock on Tuesday evening. Rebecca wasn't invited, obviously, but news traveled fast in a community where everyone was terrified of losing their water. By 8:30, her phone was buzzing with text messages from Katie, who was getting updates in real time from her hairdresser. They're voting on whether to accept your terms, Katie texted. Brian is apparently fighting it hard. Rebecca sat on her porch watching the sun set over her property, her wilted garden, her empty well, her truck full of water jugs, all because one man couldn't handle the word no. Another text came through. Vote failed. Board is split 3-3 with Brian abstaining. They're arguing now. Rebecca allowed herself a small smile. Let them argue. Every day that passed was another day closer to her deadline. In 2 weeks, if they didn't reach an agreement, she'd file the paperwork to revoke the easement. The water company had already started preliminary plans for the reroute, which meant the county would get involved, and then the whole thing would blow up in the HOA's face. Her phone rang. It was Thomas. I just got off the phone with Gerald Wright, he said. The board meeting was a disaster. I heard. Brian's trying to convince the other board members that you're bluffing. He thinks you won't actually go through with shutting off their water because it would make you look like the bad guy. He doesn't know me very well. That's what I told Gerald. Look, here's what's happening behind the scenes. 3 board members want to settle. They've seen the evidence, they know Brian's guilty, and they just want this to go away. But Brian has convinced 2 other members that fighting you is better than admitting fault. His argument is that paying you sets a bad precedent and makes the HOA look weak. Rebecca laughed bitterly. The HOA is weak. They let their president sabotage someone's property. I agree. But Brian's ego won't let him back down. He's telling people this is about principle. So what happens now? Gerald suggested something interesting. He wants to call a special meeting with all the homeowners, not just the board. He thinks if the residents understand what's really at stake, they'll force the board to settle. When? This Saturday. He's going to present the facts, show them the evidence, and let them vote on whether to authorize the settlement payment. Rebecca felt uneasy. That sounds like a setup. Brian could spin the story however he wants. That's why Gerald wants you there. What? No, absolutely not. Hear me out. Right now you're an abstract villain to most of these people. If they meet you, hear your side directly, and see that you're a reasonable person who was wronged, public opinion will shift. Gerald knows this. He's actually trying to help you. Why would the HOA's lawyer want to help me? Thomas paused. Because Gerald is smart enough to see the writing on the wall. If this goes to court, the HOA loses everything. He's trying to save his client from themselves. And that means getting rid of Brian's influence. Rebecca thought about it. The idea of standing in front of 200 angry homeowners made her stomach twist. But Thomas was right. Right now, she was just a name on a legal document. If she could make them understand what Brian had done, make them see her as a person instead of an enemy, maybe they'd turn on Brian instead of her. Okay, she said finally. I'll do it. Saturday came too quickly. Rebecca changed her outfit 4 times before settling on jeans and a simple blue shirt. She didn't want to look too casual, but she also didn't want to look like she was trying too hard. She was going for normal person who got screwed over, which honestly was exactly what she was. Katie offered to come with her for moral support, but Rebecca declined. This was something she needed to do alone. The Meadowbrook clubhouse was packed. Every seat was filled and people lined the walls. Rebecca recognized Linda Torres sitting in the 3rd row. Michelle was there too, sitting far away from Brian, who stood at the front of the room with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. Gerald Wright called the meeting to order and explained the situation in dry legal terms. Easement, waterline, conditional agreement, breach of contract. He laid out the timeline of events without assigning blame, just stating facts. Then he dropped the bomb. If this matter is not resolved within the next 10 days, the water company will begin rerouting the main line at an estimated cost of $800,000. During the 8-month construction period, residents will receive temporary water service via tanker trucks. Your water bills will increase by approximately 300% to cover these costs. The room erupted. People started shouting questions all at once. How could this happen? Who was responsible? Why hadn't they been told sooner? Gerald raised his hand for quiet. The situation arose because of a dispute between the HOA and the property owner, whose land contains the easement. The property owner's well was sabotaged and she's requesting compensation. Allegedly sabotaged, Brian interrupted loudly. Let's be clear about that. There's no proof the HOA was involved. Actually, Gerald said, and Rebecca could hear the satisfaction in his voice. There is proof. During the board's internal investigation, receipts were found showing the purchase of concrete mix on your personal credit card. Mr. Hutchins. The purchase date was 2 days before the property owner's well failed. Additionally, security footage shows you and another individual on the property owner's land the night before she lost water service. The room went silent. Everyone turned to look at Brian, whose face had gone pale. That's circumstantial, Brian said, but his voice lacked conviction. Perhaps, Gerald replied, but it's enough for a civil suit and possibly criminal charges. Which brings us to why we're here today. The property owner is willing to settle this matter if the HOA pays for a new well and provides reasonable compensation for damages. The total cost would be approximately $35,000, split among all homeowners. That's roughly $175 per household. People started murmuring. That was a lot less than an $800,000 water reroute. However, Gerald continued, the property owner is here today and has agreed to speak with you directly. I think it's important that you hear her side of the story. He gestured to Rebecca, who stood up on shaky legs. Every eye in the room was on her as she walked to the front. She'd prepared a speech in her head, but standing there in front of all those people, she forgot every word, so she just told the truth. My name is Rebecca. I've lived on my property for 8 years. I never wanted any trouble with your community. I just wanted to live quietly on my land, grow my vegetables, and enjoy my life. When Mr. Hutchins asked me to join the HOA, I politely declined. I didn't think that was unreasonable. My property isn't part of your development. It was here first. She looked around the room. Some people were nodding. Others still looked skeptical. After I refused to join, Mr. Hutchins became hostile. He came to my property multiple times, each visit less friendly than the last. Then my well stopped working. The inspector found concrete poured down the casing. Someone deliberately destroyed my only water source. Her voice cracked a little, and she took a breath to steady herself. For the past month, I've been hauling water from town in 5-gallon jugs. I can't shower normally. I can't do laundry. My garden is dying, all because I said no to joining your HOA. You're holding us hostage, someone shouted from the back. You're threatening 200 families because of a personal dispute. I'm not threatening anyone, Rebecca said firmly. I'm exercising my legal right to revoke an easement that was conditional on me having water service. I don't have water service anymore because someone destroyed my well. If you think I'm the villain in this story, then you haven't been paying attention. Linda Torres stood up. I believe her. I've talked to her. She's not some evil person trying to hurt us. She's a victim, and the HOA made her one. We don't know that for sure, Brian interjected. Her well could have failed naturally. Old wells fail all the time. Then explain the concrete, Linda shot back. Explain why you were on her property in the middle of the night. Explain the receipts. Brian's face flushed red. I don't have to explain anything to you people. I've been serving this community for 3 years. I've kept our property values high. I've maintained our standards. And now you're going to throw me under the bus because of some outsider who won't cooperate? Cooperate? Rebecca's anger flared. You wanted me to pay $250 a month to be part of a community I never asked to join. And when I said no, you destroyed my well. That's not asking for cooperation. That's extortion and vandalism. The room erupted again. this time with more people shouting at Brian than at Rebecca. Gerald had to bang his gavel multiple times to restore order. "We need to vote," someone yelled. "Let's just vote and end this," Gerald nodded. "The motion is to authorize payment of $35,000 to settle this dispute, to be funded through a special assessment divided among all homeowners." All in favor? Hands started going up. Rebecca counted quickly. It looked like at least 3/4 of the room. All opposed? Maybe 20 hands. Brian's was one of them. "The motion passes," Gerald announced. "Mr. Hutchins, I'll need to speak with you privately after this meeting." Brian looked around the room at the faces of his neighbors, many of them angry or disappointed. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the clubhouse. The door slammed behind him. People started approaching Rebecca, some to apologize, others to thank her for being reasonable. Linda hugged her. Michelle gave her a sad smile from across the room. As Rebecca drove home that night, past the perfect lawns and identical houses of Meadowbrook Estates, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. It wasn't over yet, but she'd won the battle that mattered. She'd made them see the truth. And tomorrow she could finally start getting her life back. The week after the community meeting felt surreal. Rebecca kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Brian to find some way to weasel out of the agreement or for the HOA to change their minds. But Thomas assured her that once a vote passed in a homeowner meeting, it was binding. The HOA had to follow through. Gerald Wright drew up the settlement paperwork within 3 days. The terms were straightforward. The HOA would pay $25,000 for Rebecca's new well, plus $10,000 in compensation for her suffering, inconvenience, and damaged property. In exchange, Rebecca would maintain the easement and drop any potential civil or criminal claims against the HOA. "What about Brian?" Rebecca asked Thomas when they reviewed the documents. "Does he just get away with it?" "Not exactly," Thomas said with a slight smile. "Part of the settlement requires Brian to submit a written apology acknowledging his actions." Gerald insisted on it. "It's leverage. If Brian refuses to sign the apology, the settlement falls through, and the HOA is on the hook for everything. His fellow board members have made it very clear that if he tanks this deal, they'll make sure he faces criminal charges. So he has to admit what he did? In writing. Which means if you ever wanted to pursue criminal charges later, you'd have his confession." Rebecca thought about it. Part of her wanted to see Brian arrested, handcuffed, and publicly humiliated, but another part of her, the part that was tired and just wanted her life back, knew that the apology was enough. Let him live with the shame. Let everyone in Meadowbrook know what kind of person he really was. "Okay," she said. "I'll take the deal." The signing happened on a Wednesday morning at Thomas's office. The HOA sent their new board president, a woman named Jennifer Torres, who was Linda's sister-in-law. Jennifer was professional and apologetic, shaking Rebecca's hand and telling her how sorry she was for everything that had happened. "We're making a lot of changes," Jennifer said. "New bylaws, new oversight procedures. What Brian did can never happen again." "I appreciate that," Rebecca replied. They were waiting for one more person. At exactly 10 o'clock, Brian walked in. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past 2 weeks. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes wrinkled. He barely made eye contact with anyone. Gerald placed a document in front of him. "This is your statement of apology. Read it and sign if you agree with the contents." Brian picked up the paper with shaking hands. Rebecca watched his face as he read his own words, admitting to sabotaging her well. She could see the muscles in his jaw clenching. When he got to the end, he just sat there staring at the page. "I need you to sign, Brian," Gerald said quietly. "This is the only way forward. This will ruin me." "You ruined yourself," Jennifer said coldly. "Now sign the paper so we can all move on." Brian looked up at Rebecca for the first time. She met his eyes and didn't look away. She wanted him to see that she wasn't afraid of him, that she'd never been afraid of him. He'd tried to bully her into submission and failed. He signed the document. Rebecca didn't feel the triumph she'd expected. She just felt tired. Gerald made copies of everything, and Rebecca left with her settlement check and Brian's written apology. Thomas walked her out to her truck. "You did it," he said. "Not many people would have stood up to an entire HOA like that. I didn't really have a choice. They came after me first. Still, you should be proud." Rebecca drove home and sat in her truck for a few minutes just looking at her property, her sad wilted garden, her useless well. The water jugs in the back of her truck that she'd have to keep using for a few more weeks while the new well was drilled. But it was over. She'd won. The well drilling company came out the following Monday. They spent 2 days drilling a new well, deeper than the old one. When they finished, the water pressure was actually better than before. Rebecca stood at her kitchen sink and watched clean, cold water pour from the faucet. She'd never take running water for granted again. Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to normal. Her garden recovered once she could water it properly. She took long showers just because she could. The pile of unwashed laundry that had been growing in her hallway finally got done. The relationship with Meadowbrook Estates remained complicated. Some residents went out of their way to be friendly, waving when they drove past or stopping to chat if they saw her in town. Others still seemed to resent her, though they kept their distance. Rebecca didn't care either way. She'd never wanted to be part of their community in the first place. Brian's fate became the subject of local gossip. Katie kept Rebecca updated whether she wanted to know or not. Apparently, Brian had resigned from the HOA board the day after signing the apology. His resignation letter was short and didn't include any explanation. The board accepted it immediately. Michelle filed for divorce, Katie told Rebecca over coffee one afternoon. My hairdresser says she'd been wanting to leave for years but stayed because of the kids. This was the final straw. That's sad, Rebecca said, and she meant it. Michelle hadn't done anything wrong. There's more. Brian put his house up for sale. He's moving out of state, apparently. Can't handle everyone knowing what he did? Rebecca sipped her coffee and looked out the window at her garden, now green and thriving again. Good riddance. The most surprising development came about 2 months after the settlement. Jennifer Torres knocked on Rebecca's door on a Saturday morning holding a basket of homemade muffins. I come in peace, Jennifer said with a smile. And with apology muffins. My grandmother's recipe. Rebecca invited her in and they sat on the porch. The muffins were actually delicious. I wanted to thank you, Jennifer said. I know that sounds weird, but what happened with Brian was a wake-up call for our community. We realized we'd given one person too much power and he abused it. We've completely restructured how the HOA operates now. Everything requires board approval, financial transparency, regular audits. We even hired a management company to keep things professional. That's good. We also wanted to offer you something. Jennifer pulled out a document. It's a permanent easement agreement. Much better terms than the old one. It specifically protects your property rights, guarantees you'll never be pressured to join the HOA, and includes provisions that if we ever need to access the easement for maintenance, we have to give you 30 days notice and compensate you fairly. Rebecca read through the document. It was everything she could have asked for. Why are you doing this? Because it's right, and because we don't want you to ever feel threatened by us again. You were here first. Your property is yours. We respect that now. Rebecca signed the new easement agreement. As Jennifer left, she turned back and said, You know, you're kind of a legend in Meadowbrook now. People call you the woman who stood up to the HOA and won. Some of the residents are talking about using their own leverage to fight back against HOA overreach in other ways. I didn't do it to start a revolution, Rebecca said. I just wanted my water back. Sometimes that's how revolutions start. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. Rebecca planted a new section of her garden, this time with flowers instead of vegetables. She figured she'd earned something pretty to look at. She got a new puppy, a mutt from the local shelter that liked to dig holes and chase butterflies. On warm evenings, she'd sit on her porch with a glass of iced tea watching the sunset. Sometimes she'd see the sprinklers running in Meadowbrook Estates, their perfect lawns getting their scheduled watering. She didn't feel anger anymore. She didn't feel much of anything except grateful that her own sprinkler, running off her own well, was watering her own land. Katie came over one evening and found Rebecca in the garden, planting sunflowers along the fence line between her property and Meadowbrook. Sunflowers? Really? Those are going to get huge. That's the point, Rebecca said with a grin. I want them to see something beautiful when they look over here. Might as well make the view nice. You're feeling generous. I'm feeling free. There's a difference. They sat on the porch as the sun went down, the new puppy curled up between them. In the distance, Rebecca could see lights coming on in the houses of Meadowbrook Estates. 200 families going about their evening routines, completely unaware of how close they'd come to losing everything. Do you ever regret it? Katie asked. Going after them so hard? Some people think you were too harsh. Rebecca thought about it. She thought about the weeks of hauling water, the stress, the fear, the anger. She thought about Brian's smug face in his office, convinced she'd just give up. She thought about standing in front of that room full of angry homeowners, shaking but refusing to back down. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it at all. They came after me. They tried to destroy my life because I wouldn't do what they wanted. Someone needed to show them that actions have consequences. And you did. And I did." Katie raised her glass. "To standing your ground." Rebecca clinked her glass against Katie's and smiled. "To standing your ground." Later that night, after Katie had gone home and the puppy was asleep on the couch, Rebecca walked out to her new well. It was just a simple pipe sticking out of the ground with a cap on it, nothing fancy. But it represented something more than water. It represented her refusal to be bullied, her willingness to fight for what was right, her determination to protect what was hers. She thought about Brian, somewhere in another state, probably still bitter about what had happened. She thought about the HOA and their new rules and their new respect for boundaries. She thought about all the people in Meadowbrook who now knew her name and her story. But mostly she thought about her land. Her 5 acres of peace and quiet. Her garden, her trees, her home. It was hers, and nobody was ever going to take it from her again. Rebecca went back inside, locked the door, and slept better than she had in months. Tomorrow she'd plant more sunflowers. Maybe some roses, too. She had all the water she needed now, and time to make her property as beautiful as she'd always imagined it could be. The war with the HOA was over, and she'd won.